Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 technologies that you need to start using. We think they're underutilized. Nate?
Yeah, hold on here. Oh, it's a flustered kind of morning, man. Hang on. I think you're ready to give us a demo, right?
I am. We can jump right into the terminal.
Let's go to your demo because
Okay. So the first one that I'm going to put on the list of underrated, underused technologies is strace. So strace is a great application for doing debugging. And while I'm talking a little bit about it, let me go ahead and start installing it. So strace is a system call tracing utility, and you can invoke it a couple different ways. One is you can just strace as a wrapper for another command. And so what we can see is that here, as an example, the command wrote out some output, but here is all the stuff that command did. And each line is a system call the command made with arguments that were passed to that system call. So strace is, I think, underutilized because most people look at that like giant pile of stuff that comes out of it and they're like, whoa, don't know what to do about that. But here's the thing. If you want to go down the rabbit hole and learn like an absolute ton about how things work on Linux, strace is your jam. So let's take a quick look at a slightly smaller thing. I'm just going to pipe it to less. Okay. Oops. How will we do this? I'll send it to a file. Oh, that didn't work either. Maybe I send standard output to a file. There we go. So strace sends its stuff to standard error, clearly, because I had to redirect standard error to this file. And what we're looking at is like all the stuff that that ls is doing once it's invoked. So we can see that there is a call to actually exec this executable file. And then we see this call for mmap. Well, it turns out all these system calls are documented. So if I do a man on mmap, map or unmap files and devices into memory. And then the description. mmap creates new mapping in the virtual address space of the calling process. And then it tells a little bit more details about like how the actual memory mapping is accomplished using this system call. All right, so we execute the command. It starts to map memory for itself in its virtual address space. Oh, open AT. Well, what's that do? Man, open AT. So this is to open or create a file. And if we go down to the description, the open system call opens the file specified in the path name.
That's weird.
I know, it's crazy. Crazy how this works. So it opens this etc configuration file. All right, fstat. Probably something like file status. I don't know, let's man it. All right, so in the brief description, it said get file status. Cool. These functions return information about a file in the buffer pointed to by statbuff. No permissions are required on the file itself, but in the case of fstat and lstat, permission is required on all the directories in the path that allow you to access the file. And then it tells you a little bit more about what these do. So down here, fstat was what we did, is identical to stat, except the file about which information is to be retrieved is specified by the file descriptor. All right, so somewhere in here is the file descriptor, but we can see that it returns things like the permissions that were on the file and the size of the file. All right. As you can guess, read is reading the contents of something. Then we do some more memory mapping. Then we close an open file. Then we open another command and read it and get its file status. And then we map some data out of that file. And then we close it. So this is what we're looking at when we look at a strace of a command, right? What's it doing? So if a command is not behaving the way you would expect, right? It's not providing the output you expect, or it's producing an error, you can actually use strace to actually go through and trace like all the things that command is doing, maybe down to where it failed, right? So in the case of errors, down here at the bottom of the strace, where you see that exit, around in there is where you would see the error messages and other stuff that happened, and you would just kind of like look up a little bit from that to figure out what it was doing when it encountered that error. So strace is like super handy for figuring out what something is doing. But there are a couple other ways that you can use strace. So we can use strace-c. So what strace-c does is it counts the calls to these different system calls. And it reports on how long it took doing these system calls and what percentage of the overall time was spent to these system calls. So we can see that this ls command that I ran, almost 23% of the time of it was running, it was actually calling mmap to map memory. And 22% of the time, it was opening files. And 12% of the time, it was getting the status of the different files it was working with. And 11% of the time, it was closing the file handles that it had opened. And so this is a really useful tool for kind of measuring where your program is spending its time. And again, if you're troubleshooting something, you can figure out real quick if something's taking a lot of time, it's spending a lot of time on this like weird system call that you're not expecting, maybe that's where you should focus your efforts. So you go and man the system call and figure out what it's trying to do, and that can indicate where your problem lies on your application. Also, the number of calls, that's the fourth column. If you see that one call is being done over and over and over and over and over again, just a tremendous number, like maybe that's where your problem is. Maybe you should figure out what that means and what the application is doing in that state. All right, there's another way that we can use strace though. strace-p. And actually, before I do that, let me find a process that I want to attach it to.
I was just going to ask if you could view an existing process, and here you are, right there.
Exactly. So I'm trying to pick one that's not going to like overwhelm us with data.
Yeah, I saw our syslog up there. That'll probably give you some interesting output. I don't know if it'll overwhelm you.
So when I was writing the episode,
that big blob.
When I was writing the episode, I found a couple.
Well, and obviously you shouldn't be using the one you planned on using, because that's not how Into the Terminal works, Scott.
That's right. We just go off script and like, who knows what happens.
Why don't you just run this against like the, process 0, see what happens.
Oh, yeah, no. There we go. That's what I want to do. So process 871 is tuned. All right, so tuned is a daemon that will change your performance profile, and it'll go through and set different things in procsys and /sys for determining IO scheduler and customizations to it, or memory settings, or what have you. So when I attach strace to it by specifying its process ID number, we're watching what it's doing in system calls live right now. Right? And you can see that it's doing the same thing, just over and over again, futex. All right, well, just like before, what does that mean? So I'm going to hit Control-C to detach off of that process, and I'm going to man futex. All right, so futex is fast user space locking. That's not overly descriptive. All right, so down in the description, the futex system call provides a method for waiting until a certain condition becomes true. All right, so we know that daemons run all the time, but they only do something when there's something to do. And futex is a way that we can tell the daemon through setting some shared memory stuff that there's something for it to do. And so the reason that Tundi is just sitting there banging on futex is because it's checking the shared memory register, which, by the way, right there, it's checking the shared memory register to see if something has changed that tells it that it needs to wake up and do something. So that's why it's just kind of in this endless loop of futexing. Another option would be, let me start up HTTPD. And so if I attach to this root-owned HTTPD, so this is what my Apache web server is doing. Or watching it live, right? So yeah. So we can see that it's doing a wait. It woke up and checked a socket, right? It actually connected to the network. It sent a message. It's waiting again. It's waiting again. Oh, it checks the socket to see if there's a waiting packet for an incoming request. And so what we're watching is this like daemon that's attached to port 80 and 443, just
Operation
waiting.
not permitted. Uh-oh. We just found a problem.
We can Control C and scroll back and look at what it says, right?
Yeah.
But so it's waiting for a while, and it turns out the wait system call, you specify a number of seconds that you want it to not run, right? That it's going to wait. And then when it wakes up from that wait, it goes and checks to see if there's something for it to do. So that's why it's in this wait cycle, is it's waiting. It wakes up from its wait, checks to see if there's any incoming connections on the network that it needs to handle and pass off to the worker daemons. And if there's not, it goes back to sleep and waits again. And then wakes up and checks and then goes back to sleep. All right, so if you were having a process that was misbehaving, you can attach strace to it and again, see like what's happening. I've not tried. See, Nate, we're going off script.
Uh-oh.
All right, so here I'm using both the count and the process attachment. So -C says, don't actually show me all the things it's doing.
Just does the counts that you just showed before, yeah.
Right. And what I'm hoping is if I Control C when I'm done with my sample period, excellent, there it is.
There you go.
It actually comes back and says, like, this is what it did while I was running. So instead of having to watch all that data scroll by of all the things, you can instead have it capture the data and then give you this kind of synopsis report to see if you really want to go back and watch it run, right? But just like before, we can, this syscall column at the very end of the line, there's a man page for all of them. So we can use man to kind of figure out what's happening during this and like, is it okay that it's spending 62% of its time p-selecting or 11% of its time waiting? And so we can kind of get a better idea of what's happening there. So that's my preferred underutilized utility in Linux is strace. Not enough people know about it. Not enough people use it. So go forth and use strace.
Yay, strace. All right. So as you've guessed, we're going to be talking about, you know, some underused commands, and you're going to want to stick with us until after the break because we've got some other ones that you might find familiar. And Scott, we're supposed to remind people of stuff before we switch to the next section of the show, right?
Was it that liking thing, the subscribing thing?
Yeah, I think that's it. You should like and subscribe. Hit those buttons. That's how we know that people actually like what we're doing or that we're doing a terrible job. We don't want to know that we're doing a terrible job. We want to know that you love what we're doing, so you should do that.
So after the transition, we're going to cover several additional things. And so, Nate, you're going to talk about Identity Manager.
Yes, I am. I love how you ask that questioningly, like, are we sure?
The demo gods, may they smile upon us. Then I'm going to talk about Tlog and session recording. And then Nate's going to talk a little bit about cockpit. And we'll also talk about Kickstart. So stay with us, everybody.
All good stuff. All right, we'll be right back. And like that, we're right back.
Thank you, producer Nate.
All right, so I had to kill my share before because it did not. It was up when it shouldn't have been, and the quickest way was to just kill it off. So give me a second here to bring it back.
Well, while Nate is bringing up his demo, not a great start for the demo gods, by the way.
No, not a great start.
Now is the time where, of course, if you're a live viewer, you can interact with us in chat. And I saw that there was some stuff going on, so I'll address that while Nate's working on his demo. But if you're a deferred viewer, please feel free to leave us a comment. Nate and I respond to comments all the time, although sadly, sometimes I respond to them as Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But that's either me or Nate, by the way.
It's
so
one of us. Could be either.
So please leave us a comment if you have questions or comments on the show. All right, Nate, take it away.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. All right. So if you haven't seen IDM, or if you don't know what IDM is, like that's the whole point of this show, right? IDM is based on the upstream project called FreeIPA, and it's basically like an Active Directory style identity domain for your Linux systems. And I've talked about this a lot. We haven't touched a lot on IDM on into the terminal because it is decidedly not terminally, right? You're looking at it right here. But I have done a bunch of other content about IDM. There's a lot of really cool features that I'm not going to dive into today because we're trying to just touch on these things. But I did want to show you a really quick demo of just like, here, look, I've got some users. And you can see here I've got a bunch of users already defined. And I've also got hosts, right? So this gives you this concept of how hosts and users are both in this domain. And then, of course, you can do things with the hosts and the users to say, permit access. These users can access these hosts. Or there's under policy here, there's sections for pseudo rules, which I don't have any defined at the moment, but you can set up a pseudo rule, right? That says these users can do these administrative level things on these set of hosts, right? There's a bunch of different authentication mechanisms. There's SSO options. There's pass key options where you can use something like a YubiKey to authenticate your user. I think there's biometric options. There's all kinds of ways that you can authenticate users. Really, my demo here is actually really simplistic. Again, I didn't want to go too far. I'm going to switch over to a console, which means I got to switch my screen share. And then I'm going to just show you that one of these users' accounts. So we're going to be using, let me look at my notes here so I can remember which user I wanted to use. So I'm sure, actually here, let me show you how that host-based access stuff works. If we go over to groups here, hang on. I have a thing blocking my screen here. Stop that. There we go. The user groups we have here, we have a user group 1, right? We have a user group 2 as well. And then underneath host groups, we have a host group 1 and a host group 2. And as you might guess, people that are in user group 1 are also in host group 1, and people that are in user group 2 are also in host group 2. And we have two client machines. If you look under hosts here, we've got CLI1 and CLI2. CLI2 was misbehaving, so we're not going to use CLI2 as in our demos today. This is an older deployment that I had set up, and something's wrong with that machine. But if we look at host groups for CLI1, you see it's in host group 1. And if we went back to, where was it, under host groups, we bring up host group 1 and look at HBAC, which is host-based access control rules. You can see user group 1 can access host group 1. Let me show you who's in user group 1, and that's the last thing I want to show you inside of the web UI here. So back to groups, back to user groups, back to user group 1, and you can see the account Murph is in user group 1. So Murph should have access to CLI1, right? I know that was a lot to go through, but now let me switch that share now that I've shown you how that stuff works. Let's see, which screen share do I need here? Is that the one I need? That's the one I need. Here we go. All right. Yes, that's the right. Not sharing the wrong terminal window. So we're going to show you here. So remember I said Murph should have access to this machine. And I have local DNS set up so that these things work. But CLI1 dot IDM0.lab, as you might know, like obviously that's not a normal domain name. I have local DNS for this stuff. And it'll ask me for her password. And again, if you have other authentication mechanisms set up, it will have you use those authentication mechanisms. I don't have shared home directories set up, and I didn't set it to create home directories when you log in. That's why I got this error here. But you can see here I am on CLI1, right? Now, you saw I didn't have any sudo rules set up, so I can't show you anything really fancy, but there's user access. Now, you might remember Murph was the only person in that group. So if I tried one of the other accounts, like Butters, for example, I think the result here is that it just rejects the password. No, it actually just drops me. It says, nope, you can't access this machine. That means that I put in his password correctly, but it didn't allow me access to the system. So there's a really quick and dirty demo of IDM. Are there any questions while we were here? Looks like you're answering some questions in chat.
Yeah, but I think it's worth calling out. So Shantanu asks, what feature is doing the users and groups on the final compute machine? So like, is it LDAP that's doing the users and groups? Is it NIS
so
doing the users and groups?
FreeIPA/IDM use sort of a conglomeration of different services to make this stuff work. The directory that is storing it is an LDAP directory. There's also a Kerberos domain that handles things like authentication tokens and whatnot. And there's a few other things in the background, like runs its own DNS server, for example, so that you can run host DNS. So the way I do that local DNS that I was talking about is I actually have a local caching name server that I use for things like ad filtering and whatnot. And I've delegated this idm0.lab domain over to the directory controller for that lab. And it just, every time I register a host, it puts a DNS entry in there. So it's actually really slick that way. Very similar to what you'd expect in like an Active Directory domain where it handles DNS. Is that the only question we had?
That was it.
All right, cool. Well, I think the next one's back to you, Scott.
Yeah. So let me share my other screen.
Okay.
There we go. So another underutilized feature in RHEL is session recording. So session recording, which is based on a package called Tlog, right, for terminal logging. It will actually capture all of the content of a terminal session, store it as text, and write it to your logging provider of choice. So we're going to do the setup through cockpit, through RHEL Web Console here. And you can see over in the side nav bar, there's a option for session recording down there towards the bottom. So I'm just going to go click on that. And there are currently no recorded sessions on the machine because I haven't configured it and enabled it yet. So I'm going to use the little settings gear up in the corner. And there's basically two groups of settings. One is the general configuration for session recording, right? So I can indicate the shell that should be used when we're recording sessions, any login messages that I should provide to people if their session is being recorded, how big those log messages should be, what things I want to capture, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy with all of those default settings. So I'm just going to save that. And then the other thing we can do is the SSSD config. So this is whose sessions should we capture? And so if I do sum, it says, all right, what's the list of users that you want to capture? What's the list of groups that you want to capture? So when somebody logs in, we know that they're in this list of users or they are part of this list of groups and we'll capture the session. And if they're not in the list, we won't capture their session. I'm just going to use the really simple all, right? And notice that all changes that additional criteria a little bit to say you can choose to not capture these specific people or people who belong to these specific groups, right? But I'm going to leave those blank, meaning I capture all. So again, I'm going to hit the save button. And at this point, I've enabled session recording. So let me go down to my terminal. And I'm going to issue to root. Nope. Let's try that again. Sudo issue to root. There we go. And we're going to SSH RHEL user at localhost. If I had it enabled. That's what happens when we have too much work during the week, Nate. You should really talk to your boss about that.
I think we both need to convince people above us that we need to be full-time YouTubers, and that's the best way for us to bring value to Red Hat.
Full-time YouTubers, man, that would be a little bit crazy. All right, there we go. So I log into my machine via SSH, right? There's the message that we saw in the previous configuration, right? So I know that my session is being recorded. And I could do stuff like df and password. And I can even do things like become root. And maybe it didn't work. I'm just going to quit. All right, and after my session has been closed, if I go back up to the session recording item there, there's my session that's been recorded.
There you go.
I click on it, and I can play it. And let me make it a little bit bigger so you can read it. So remember I was talking about session recording, and I like fixed it in SSH, and then I was talking for a little bit. Well, that's the delay that we're seeing here. It's talking for a little bit. Oh, wait, command. Then I looked at my disk free. Then I looked at a file. Then I sudoed and became root. And then I ran a command that produced an error. And not only did it show me the output from all these commands, but it also showed me the error output for all these commands.
Yeah.
So this was actually all sent to logging daemon of my choice. But before we do that, I also wanted to show you this piece. See this little search bar down here? Oh,
I didn't know that existed. That's cool, though. So that
Yeah.
this will look through the session to find when you ran cat.
Yeah, and so it was at 13 seconds, and I can click on that, and it'll jump me over to 13 seconds into the recording. If I
So if you're looking for something, for example, like did this guy change Etsy password, which is something that you did do in there, you could have searched for password and saved yourself the time of watching maybe a very long session recording. So that's handy.
Right. So it highlights all the places in the session where that string occurs, because we're actually recording the contents as text. Right. So let me go back over to my terminal on Web Console here. And let me do a little bit more. All right, so right here, that highlighted area, that's an example message that got put in by session recording. So it's all stored in text. And that's why you can put in the text you're looking for, and it will tell you the time codes that go along with that text. Because this is going through logging, you can actually send these session recorded bits of data to a central place. So you don't have to worry about like, what if somebody blanks the log? Do I lose all my sessions? You can actually store them in different places. You can even use different log analysis tools to do your own analysis outside, or you can congregate them together with their session ID, and you can use a Tlog player on the remote machine and give it a session ID, and it'll actually reconstruct the session on the command line for you.
Yeah, I've done that with outputting these to text instead of to the logging daemon, and then they're pretty much portable. You can copy them to a different machine and use the Tlog player and look at them wherever. So if you're thinking about, I work in an environment where we need to keep X number of days or weeks or whatever of these logs, but dealing with the system journal would be a pain in the butt. You can tell it to output them somewhere else, and then you can back that up or store it on a remote system, something like that, where it's a little more central.
Right. And so a couple places where this is really useful, right? We talked about configuring it and like how's an admin you interact with it, but what does it actually do for you? Well, one is like Nate said, somebody changed Etsy password and you need to figure out who. So you can use the searching tools or text searching tools to figure out where those exist in different sessions and then replay the session to figure out what happened. The other thing I really like is that it captures both output and errors. So when we look at other technologies like Audit, where it tells you like who edited a file, it just tells you the name of the file and the person that did something to it and what they did to it, but you don't necessarily get the context of what was changed in the file. Whereas with session recording, I could actually watch, if they opened up VI, I would see the VI session. And if they go in and like tweak it, I would see their changes happening in the VI session.
Right? Yeah, that's what I really like about it, is that you can actually see a visual editor, for example, or a TUI or something that's up on the screen. You can actually see what they did in it. It's not just, oh, they ran the thing, but what did they do? Oh, well, we're not sure. You can actually see the keystrokes. You can see the cursor as it moves around. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then the other thing I really liked, did you catch where I ran a command that didn't work, Nate?
Yeah, I did.
Do you remember the name of the command?
Feline instead of cat.
Yeah, so like somebody calls you up. I ran the command you told me, but it didn't work. I don't know what's going on. You gave me an error, right? And then you can look back and be like, yeah, I told you to run cat. I did. I ran cat. No, you ran feline. That is not the same thing.
Yeah, right.
Right. So it gives you like the whole session with context, which a lot of the other tools don't provide. And that's why I think session recording and Tlog is an underutilized feature that you should be using now.
Absolutely. Get on that. Especially if you're in an environment that, a lot of the use cases you just outlined there are things like troubleshooting, but it's also good for like secure environments where you have to know what people did. I know for example, in the financial industry, this is a big deal, right? Like, did someone log in and try to falsify something? Yeah, well, now you can tell. All right, so my next demo is the good old web console. So let me switch my share around here.
Oh, Nate, I turned my nose up at your web console. It's for
my nose.
For noobs. Oh, nobody uses it but noobs.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It's only for the noobs, right? No, it's not just for the noobs, because there's actually some really useful stuff in here. So let me get to I was worried that switching my screen share while you were on it. I can't see the screen share. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it. It's it's very big though.
Restream is messing with me. All right, I can make it a little smaller. Like I said, Restream's not even showing it to me. Okay, so as long as you can see it, that's what matters. All right. On web console, so RHEL, where did web console came about with RHEL 8, or was it in RHEL 7? I don't even remember if it was in 7. I don't think it was in 7.
I think it was in 7 for the later parts of 7, but if 7 is end of maintenance, we don't like first rule about RHEL 7 is don't talk about RHEL 7.
We don't talk about RHEL 7. Okay, so from RHEL 8 on, there's this cool thing. It's based on the upstream cockpit, but we call it web console because it's a little more indicative of exactly what it is and what it does. But this is an administration panel for your RHEL system that has a lot of cool plugins, and we're always making and releasing new ones, right, that do more and add more functionality. I think there's one in development now that I don't think is released yet, so I don't know if we can talk about it. But pretty cool stuff is happening with web console. And this is what you'd expect. Now, I'm an old admin. I remember the days, like the early days of web administration consoles, and they were generally considered a really bad idea. So initially, when I heard about web console, I'm like, I don't want that. And then when I started looking at it, figuring out how it works and whatnot, it's actually pretty good. So here I am I've just imagine I've just logged into web console. Um, I logged in as a user, not as root or something. This user has sudo privileges. So I can actually use web console as an administrator, but at the moment I'm logged in as just my user, as you'd expect, right? You see up here at the top, it says limited access with that yellow lock up there. If I click on limited access, or right here where it says click turn on administrative access, it'll ask me for my password, just like sudo would have. So I'm going to use my password manager to pop that in there, authenticate, and now I have administrative access. And I show that basically because I want you to know, right, that if you log in as a standard user, or say you've delegated access to like a junior admin or something, that you want them to be able to use this, you can still leverage that sudo mechanism to give them the access that they want. Now, I don't know how well it works for filtering sudo. One of these days I'm going to have to try that out. Like, what if I limit them to what they can do with sudo? How does web console treat that? My user has full administrative access through sudo, so I can do full administrative stuff through web console. All right, so I've got a bunch of plugins for cockpit slash web console installed. I wanted to show, I don't have like a really planned demo here. I just want to kind of show you some of the cool things that I think are useful here. Things like logs. I can go look through my logs. You can see you can filter your logs based on what you're looking for. You can see what generated these errors and what they are. And you can see I've got a bunch of errors in mine. Maybe these are things I should look into. But some of these are the output from, say, Podman containers that are running. This one I can tell you right here is a Podman container that I'm running, and it's just the output that came from the container. And sometimes the system journal can't accurately determine whether that's an error or just normal log output. That's why these are showing up as warnings. Networking is another one that I use pretty frequently on this particular host, because this is my home lab virtualization machine. And I do a lot of network bonding, or not bonding, a lot of network bridging to get from my virtual machines and onto my home network VLANs, right? I actually have my home network separated into VLANs. So I have like a lab, and I have a place for services to run, and a place for my Internet of Things stuff. And I've got separate VLANs for all of that. And that can be kind of a nightmare to sometimes configure at the command line, even with Network Manager, right? NMCLI is a really nice tool. Making bridges, especially when there's VLANs involved and trunks and all kinds of stuff, it gets really layered and complicated quickly. And when you have a nice visual interface to get that done, this is one of these places where I think web console really shines, right? So you can see here, I've got all these Ethernet adapters here, like V Ethernet 10, I think goes to bridge number 10, like bridge 2 SVC. I've even named it in a way. I know that's my services network. Um, I have all these alternate IPs associated with it. Those are actually IPs that I have mapped into Podman containers, so that I run some things in Podman on this host and some things in virtual machines. There's another bridge for my Internet of Things stuff. So like my Home Assistant machine runs in that network so that it's accessible and it can reach all of my IoT stuff. But then I can of course reach it and manage its VM. So I think that's really helpful. I talked about Podman. Here I can manage Podman containers right through here. Right now, some of these are kind of hard to read, but if I go down here, you can see I've got an HTTPD container. Surprising, right? That I would have I, being one of the hosts of Into the Terminal, would have a HTTPD container on my home lab machine. Now, these are things that are owned by me, right? There's also these are ones that are running as root, and that's because I can see them because I have enabled administrative access, right? So these are like, here, look, there's Jellyfin. If you're curious how I serve uh, content to my home network, like media, like shows and whatnot. Yeah, there's a couple things up and running here. Navidrome for music, right? Anyway, Podman containers, and these are all pods. So you can see, look, within these pods. Let me find one that has. I don't think I have any really complicated pods here that have a whole bunch of containers within them, but you can see here that you can expand it and see how many containers are within each pod, stuff like that. And the other thing that I really, really love about Web Console is this virtual machines plugin, which this talks to libvirt, which is, of course, what I run all my VMs in. This lets me bring up things like consoles for VMs. You've seen me use this a bunch of times on this show. Whenever I have a demo that I have to be at the console of a system, right? So here, let's here's the machines I was using for the IDM demo. Let's bring up CLI 0. That's the machine that I logged into with my test user. Because I have it zoomed in, it's hard to see some of this stuff. But see right there, there's my console. A little bit's off the bottom of the screen, so it's a little bit hard to use in this small of a window. But there you go. You can see the VM console. And I don't want to walk through every single piece, but there's a lot of really useful things in here. Anything you think I should show, Scott? Anything you love about Web Console?
Oh, well, we already saw the integrated terminal, right? So you
Yep.
can go through your web application and still get that terminal access that we all know and love here on Into the Terminal.
Yep.
Software updates, so we can apply software to the machine.
That's a good one. And I intentionally haven't updated this machine in a while just for this demo. So, you're welcome.
Yeah. By the way, I see automatic updates is turned off, Nate. You know that I'm really against automatic updates, and I have yet another proof point of why it's a terrible idea that I can mention at the end of the show.
Okay. Yeah, automatic updates is really cool in concept. I love that you can do it, but the old sysadmin in me is like, no, we don't do automatic updates. We plan scheduled maintenance windows, and that's when we do updates.
So, like, I joked at the beginning of the segment that Web Console is for noobs. That's I think the stigma with Cockpit and Web Console. The reality is, even as an experienced administrator, there's a lot of really nice stuff here. Like one of our coworkers told me that he uses Cockpit to do all of his disk management. He will never again use command line utilities to do disk management because things like LVM resizing, you literally say, you click on the LVM that you want to resize, you click a button that says resize, and then there's a slider. And you just slide the size to what you want. And it will do growth
you don't like
or reduction.
You don't like in your head converting blocks to bits, to bytes, to kilobytes, to kibibytes, or whatever it is that we're using nowadays.
Well, it's even worse than that because LVM uses logical extents. And so you have to know like the amount of disk space and then what your logical extent size is to figure out like how big you need to make it. And I invariably do the math wrong. And so with the slider, I don't have to do the math anymore. And that's pretty fantastic.
You just make the slider go. Yeah, that is handy. That is handy.
So yeah, like I joke that it's for noobs. It makes a lot of administrative tasks really smooth.
Yeah, I mean, we give each other a lot of flack about the GUI versus not GUI, right? Being completely honest, right? There was a day when it was just like a badge of honor to be able to do everything text mode over SSH, right? And awesome. You can do that. That's great. What do you have to prove? Really, what do you have to prove? If you can get the job done, why does it matter how you did it? Right?
Well, ultimately, you still kind of need to know some of those things because what happens when you're not able to that's for whatever reason, right? You need to troubleshoot it. So I'm not saying like Web Console takes away the need for us to learn things.
Exactly. You absolutely need an understanding of what's going on under the covers. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if you know how to do it and you can do it at the command line, but it just is so much easier with a GUI, use the GUI. No one's watching. And if they are, they shouldn't judge.
Well, and the other thing that is like an underreported feature of Web Console, do you know that you can use it to proxy into other machines?
Yes. Yeah, I didn't set up anything to demo that, but yeah, here, let me go back to my share. There we go. Which I still can't see in here. I'm assuming you can see it. Up here in the corner here, if we click on this little down arrow, I can add in another host. And I don't have one that I can easily set up authentication for, but basically you'd put in a host name and a username, and then it'll connect to that host. So if you have shared authentication across all of your systems with maybe something like IDM, this makes it really simple. As if the username and password matches across the board, you can add in several hosts here. Now, I've heard some reports that if you get too many hosts in here, it starts to really make web console kind of sluggish. I don't know if there's something that's planned to resolve that. I also don't know what that upper number is, but just keep that in mind. If you've got 1,000 hosts you're trying to manage this way, your mileage may vary.
And I think that's another thing, right? Like web console works great when you're managing 1 host or 5 hosts. As you're managing 100, you're not going to be able to connect to the web consoles of 100 boxes,
Right.
right? So you start to learn how to do automation the larger your fleet gets.
From what I recall, there's a way to set up web console on those sort of sub hosts, the host you're going to manage from a central place, that they don't run the full web application. They run just a socket that web console can connect to and issue commands, right? I think that's how it works. Anyway, going off the reservation.
All right. So our last thing is Kickstart.
Yeah.
And the reason I advocated really heavily for Kickstart on this list is because I think it's like a lost art that is falling away. Because a lot of people's experience with RHEL is virtual machines. And so they use tools like VMware templates to they install a machine and then they just make it a template. And then they just stamp it out from their template. But then if you need to do Amazon stuff, well, how do you go from your VMware template to your Amazon stuff? Right. So
I mean, yeah, you can convert stuff and whatever, but I personally think that in certain environments, there are environments where this is not true, but in certain environments, Pixie booting and passing in a Kickstart is actually more efficient than deploying from a template because you get up to the minute deployments. Right now, obviously that's not always true, but that's the way we did it when I worked in higher ed. We had a bunch of systems. I could deploy a system in minutes because I just handed it off through satellite and off it went. Yeah. By the way, satellite can do Pixie and Kickstart and build your systems for you, so it's pretty powerful that way. So
the other thing I found kind of obnoxious about templating is it encourages us to do silly things. Like we start with one template, but then oh, I need a web server. So somebody installs GPD and then makes that a template.
Yes.
And so you end up with this growing pile of template cruft that goes across all your templates because they're the same box that's been manipulated and jacked with over time. And oh yeah, that guy, he forgot to sysprep the image. And so it's got an old MAC address in the template.
Or an SSH key or something. Yeah. Yeah.
And so if you do Kickstart where you're doing a brand new install, you start with a fresh box.
Right.
And then it's automated, which means you don't have to sit there and answer all the questions. And if you have a reasonably performant source for your installation media, it takes 10 minutes or 5 minutes to do the Kickstart. So, it's roughly the same time as a clone of your template in a lot of instances.
Right. So one of the reasons it worked so well when I worked in higher ed was we had a bunch of different types of systems we had to churn out. Some of them were web, some of them were databases, some of them whatever, right? So we just had, different sized VM definitions that we would deploy to, and we had different layouts in Kickstart, right? So then there was no base image that we deployed. It would just install right from my my installation medias that I had on the web. And what I wanted to show you here, and again, I still can't see the stupid share. Can you see a Kickstart file? Okay, so this is a Kickstart file. I wanted to show you this because this came right out of a RHEL 9 installation. Earlier today, I did a RHEL 9 installation from the DVD. I made some custom choices within the installation wizard. And then at the other end, when I had the system built, right inside a root's home directory is an anaconda-ks.cfg file. And that's what this file is. And you can see here that I did a graphical installation. It defines some repositories that were run by the installation media. You can see here that I told it that it installed from the CD-ROM, that it will install from the CD-ROM, right? Because that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to reproduce the thing that I did manually. And then here's this nice little set of packages. I told it to install a minimal system. I told it to install container management, which adds in container tools and Podman and whatnot. You could add in more things here. So if I wanted to
Like
I don't know,
strace?
add in, what's that? Like
Strace?
strace? If I wanted to add strace, you literally just, you have to know the package name. You just put the package name and it'll add it inside of, you see how there's this percent packages. That means that we're in the packages section of the Kickstart file. Just add strace and it'll install the latest version of strace. And I believe you can even say, I want a specific version, as long as you know the version. The same way you would do it inside of an RPM, the name of the RPM package. If you did like strace dash 1.2.3, it would install strace version 1.2.3 as long as that's in your repository. You can see how there's an @ symbol in front of container management. That's because that's a package group. If I wanted to install, I don't know, like virtualization host or something, I would do @ virtualization host, and then it would install that group, right?
Yeah,
The other really cool, sorry, go ahead.
you can get that list of groups from like a DNF group list, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'd have to look up the syntax again, but yes, you can get it from DNF. You can say, what's the groups? This is the other thing. I defined a custom file system when I did this, or file system layout, I should say. And that's the other powerful thing about Kickstart is if you have a collection of Kickstarts, say this one needs a larger, I don't know, var, and this one over here needs a larger opt or serve or whatever, right? You just have a different Kickstart that will define that partition table in a different layout. And then it'll do the installation and just lay out that other partition table. Now, you do have to have some like idea of how big the disk you're deploying to is, because Kickstart isn't great about doing this dynamically. However, there are commands you can put in here that just says, okay, lay out these in exactly the sizes that I want, and then you'd have one at the end that says fill the rest of the disk, right? So that's about as dynamic as it gets. But you can't, I don't think there's a way to say, make this like this percentage of the disk and that this percentage of the disk. Maybe you can do math within here. I think there are more advanced ways to use Kickstart that you can do calculations for things like swap size, right? So you can get pretty deep in this kind of stuff. The other cool thing, if you're dealing with satellite, you can define snippets within satellite. So say your disk layout is a snippet. Maybe you have 3 different disk layouts and you can just call the snippet you want inside of the Kickstart file, right? And there's a bunch of ways you can use snippets like that. Here you can see I told it to add a user, really helpful. This sets a password for the user. But the other thing I wanted to show you was at the end. So there's 2 special blocks you can use, one called pre and one called post. And those are literally shell that will run before the installation is pre and after the installation is post. So if I just added a %post here and then started adding in, I don't know, like maybe I want to add a user, or maybe I want to add an authorized SSH key for the user that I added. I can, if I know how to do that with shell, I can do it here. Like I can, do an mkdir for like home Nate .ssh, and then I'm not going to do all of this to show it to you, but then you'd like change the permissions to make sure it's owned by the right user. Then you'd add an authorized keys file, put that in there. If you want to enable a service at the end, right? I could do a systemctl enable for like, I don't know, cockpit.service. Now, obviously, I would have had to have installed cockpit, which is not installed by default. So back up in that packages section, I would have had to say cockpit and whatever cockpit plugins I wanted added. I was going to go through and demo an actual installation, but I had trouble getting that going. But I am going to put in the description of today's video a link to our knowledge base articles about how to get a Kickstart file, what some of the syntaxes are, and how to build an ISO, because that's probably the most portable way to use a Kickstart file. You can actually bake it into an ISO file. But if you wanted to go full bore and go ahead and set up a Pixie server and pass off Kickstart files, that's a whole other way to get that done. It's a lot more expandable that way, or that's the word I'm looking for.
So I've also
Extensible.
like dropped scripts that get run as RC local.
Yep.
Like here in the post, I use a here document or cat to create the script contents that gets put into the file system, and then I can also set it up so that the machine will trigger that when it boots. And then I did have 2 notes, Nate. One is %pre is a little bit different than %post because of how it runs. So %pre is running in the installer RAM disk.
Right.
Before,
Syntax is different. Right.
Yeah, and it's before your system has been installed, right? So there isn't going to be a home Nate because there's not a home directory
True.
created on your machine yet because it's pre-installation. So you're limited in the commands that you can run to be the ones that are in part of the installer RAM disk environment. So I've used it for things like pre-partitioning a disk or clearing
Yep.
a disk before we
Yep.
start partitioning stuff. But it runs in like this RAM disk environment. It doesn't affect the machine that comes out the other side directly.
Yeah, I worked with a customer who used pre inside of their Kickstart files to identify the hardware that's in the machine, right? So, like, what network adapters do I have? What size is my disk? That kind of stuff. And then it would make variables and stuff out of all that that it could then use later in the Kickstart file. So that's a really good use for pre.
Yeah. And then on the customer portal, there is an application that will actually validate your Kickstart. So once you've made all of these changes, how do you know that it's actually going to work? Or if you like use it and it produces some kind of weird error, you could take your file and run it through this validator, and it will tell you whether it complies with Kickstart syntax or not, and can help you troubleshoot stuff. The other thing is if you don't answer a question in your Kickstart, no worries. The installer will actually ask you. So it may actually start up the graphical installer and have one question. And when you click the answer to that question, then everything else is automated. So I've used that too. Like maybe I didn't know the time zone because somebody
Right.
else was in installation. So I would not specify the time zone, which meant that when somebody booted off of my whatever install media and ran the Kickstart, it would start up the GUI and ask them to specify their time zone and to click it. But then the rest of the installation was automated.
Right. Right. Useful stuff. All right. I think that brings us to the end of our demos.
Yeah, so I did promise Shantanu that I would, or Shantanu that I would reference something I forgot about strace. So I had put it in the notes and I forgot to do it in my demo. There's an option for strace called follow forks, follow forks, so that when you attach it to a process or you have it wrap a process, if that process executes other things during its runtime, strace will attach to those two and report on them. So that's a handy option, especially for more complex applications like HTTPD, where it may be spawning other things to do work for it.
Right.
So, Nate, next episode.
Something. We're doing
Yeah.
something in the terminal. Or maybe in the web console. Probably in the terminal.
We'll be back next week with another episode of the terminal, to be determined, but it'll be here.
It'll be here.
Yeah. So, any parting words of wisdom, Nate?
Leave more time to prepare your demos because this morning was hectic for me. Things would have been better if I had taken more time, folks. This week was busy though.
Only your boss would let you be a full-time YouTuber. I hear he's a
I know that guy. All right, yeah. Just thanks for watching, folks. I hope you all have a great weekend, and I think that's all I have to say for today.
Right on. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week here.
Catch you next time.